Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's seminar, which is part of RENCI's Accelerating Collaborative Team Science webinar series. This is the last webinar for the year, as the team will be taking the summer off. And I'll introduce myself. My name is Alyssa LaFaro. I'm the Research Communications Manager for the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I do a lot of storytelling around researchers here at the university for our research publication. Today we have three incredible science communication experts with us: Tamara Poles, Dr. Brian Southwell, and Michelle Jewell. And I'm excited to introduce this group. But first, please note that while we typically disable Zoom Q&A, today we want you to use it. So feel free to put questions there at any point, and then we will answer the questions later in the webinar. So before we meet our guests, let's take a quick look at how we define team science. So many folks tend to use this definition from the National Cancer Institute. Team science is a collaborative effort to address a scientific challenge that leverages the strengths and expertise of professionals, oftentimes trained in different fields. And since we have such a packed schedule of great speakers today, we're going to dive right in. So let's get started. So Tamara Poles is up first. Tamara, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do within the field of science communication.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tamara Poles. I'm founder and CEO of Universal SciComm, formerly known as SciComm Consulting. And what I do is I provide trainings and workshops and consultations in science communication. So I train scientists how to communicate to the public, and then I find ways to so they can apply those skills in science communication. So if they want to do outreach to a school group or to a certain community, I will put them in there or train them up so they can be more effective communicators.
Wonderful. And so we're going to start out with a bang of a question. So what common mistakes do you see when researchers and research teams first try to amplify their discoveries beyond academia, and how can they be avoided?
Oh, that is such a loaded question. How much time do we have? I'll try to be brief and hit the high ones. The very first thing is that scientists and researchers and research teams don't think about doing the SciComm until after the research is already done. So whenever they come to me and they're like, "Oh, I need to do outreach," I'm like, who do you want to talk to? What media do you want to use? So it's good to have that thought before you start doing, or that need comes up that you need to do outreach or science communication. The next one is that people don't believe that science communication is a field on its own. So there are classes, there are a whole programs at colleges and universities for this. There's a publication, there's research. So there's a lot that goes into science communication. So some scientists that I meet up with, they immediately go to me and they're like, "Oh, but I'm a professor. So I teach all the time. I talk to people all the time, or I write all the time." And I'm like, "Okay, you're writing to your peers though, or you're speaking to your students that are in your program. So they already have this fundamental knowledge of what you're speaking about." So there's actually research and skills and techniques that you need to use when you're communicating with, say, general public or K-12 students and things like that. So realizing and recognizing that science communication is a skill that you can learn, but it's not just a one and done type of thing. It is a whole field. Another misconception is that science communication is dumbing it down. And that is my biggest pet peeve, is that you're not dumbing down your science by any means. Like, you are, by doing science communication, just because you're not using the big words or the jargon and things like that, doesn't mean that you're dumbing down your science. You're making it accessible to more audiences. So say you wouldn't make a movie without having subtitles, or you wouldn't add stairs to a building without adding a ramp. Think of science communication, and when you're speaking with different audiences, that you're building on ramps to catch them up to where you are. So that's one of my biggest pet peeves, is when people say it's dumbing down their science. And the other one that I see all the time is when my scientists go out and they say they've done all of that, they checked all the first boxes that I listed, and they go out and say they speak to some teenage students and they want to use their words, like, sus in Chicago and stuff like that. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, isn't that awkward? Like everybody's had witnessed that before. You've even been on the receiving side, or you're the one that's trying to use like the cool hip words. That is actually not being authentic to who you are. So something that's an easy start for a lot of researchers is to identify who they are and who they represent and lean into that. Like if I'm going into a school group or something, they know I'm old because I'm older than they are. So I'm not going to try to pretend that I'm their age and that I know their words. I'm going to still say the words that I would normally use, but words that they would understand. Because if I'm not being authentic to myself, then how can they believe anything I'm trying to say, because I'm already lying to them? So being authentic is also key. So those are some big ones that I always see when I'm out in the field and teaching scientists are those.
I love that description too of the stairs and the ramp. I'm totally stealing that for when I explain what I do to people.
Good, you should.
Yeah, yeah, and we tend to say, I agree, dumbing it down is like a terrible phrase. We tend to say simplify,
Mhm.
but yeah, you're really just trying to make it accessible. And so that leads me into my next question. What are the tools to do this? What are the tools or practices that you recommend for research teams that want to build strong communication practices?
I love that question because that you could just take a workshop from me. So I actually have a lot of workshops that help train scientists and give them these skills. Everybody has to take the essential science communication workshop, which is foundation where all the other workshops build on that one workshop. My workshops, after you take it, you will, like, for instance, the essential ones, all of my workshops, you leave with something that you can directly apply to your field. You either leave with a pitch, you either leave with a abstract that is attainable to everybody or accessible to everyone, and you leave with something that is a working product. So that's the benefit of my workshops, and also it's really hands-on and engaging as well. So yeah, there's that. Or there's other resources out there that you can look into that you can develop these skills or identify these skills, but mainly knowing your audience and who you want to speak to and how you want to do it. That's actually the key, because there's so much of assumption that we have, and I even had it when I was a researcher. I just assumed, oh yeah, I'm going to go to this community and I'm going to tell them this because this is important to them. This is what I thought was important to them. Did I ever talk to that community and ask them what's important? So one of the key starts is getting to know and talking with the people that you want to speak with or you want to communicate with, instead of talking at them and telling them what they need to know. Talk with them, because the communication is a two-way street. Ask them questions, ask them what's important to them, and then tailor your point or your content to fit their world or their experience. And I always look at it as, I got $1 million grant, I want to work with a rural community, I'm going to buy them all computers. Did I ever talk to that community and see if they needed computers first? Maybe they don't have the infrastructure to have Wi-Fi or internet. Maybe they need buses, maybe they need anything, stuff that, like, this would be solved if we just had a conversation. So having a conversation with the audience that you want to meet with, meeting them where they are, and also getting to the point, which is I have not done, but a lot of times researchers want to talk about all of this other stuff instead of getting to the why they should care first. You need to get to the why do you care first? Why does my audience care about what I'm saying? And get to that first. If you haven't said that within the first 2 seconds, you've lost your audience. So think of a research paper, but flip it upside down. Get to your point first and then explain the rest.
Whenever I present to researchers at UNC about how to communicate their work, I always suggest just give your elevator pitch to your family, your
Right.
parents, your grandparents, your nieces and nephews, because I am convinced like if a 12-year-old can understand it, then everybody can understand it.
That's one of the homework assignments from one of my workshops. I say, okay, now you have this pitch. Your pitch is going to change throughout time and whoever you're communicating with. So make sure you test it out on your family members, because family is definitely going to be honest about what you're saying, and they will check out faster. So how do you gain their interest and practice that? So perfect practice makes perfect.
Yeah. And here we are already talking about audiences, so how can science teams develop communications that are audience aware without oversimplifying the science or losing the nuance? So in other words, what is that sweet spot of accessibility?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and that relates back to developing and building those meaningful connections with that audience. If you're going to continuously talk to an audience or a community, say it's maybe it's the rural community or some type of community, you should be building that all along, connecting with those folks or working with someone that directly works with those communities. And then once you build that, then you can tailor your pitch, you can tailor your content to better support that community. So that's how they can do it. And also using your resources. I know a lot of research teams and researchers are a part of an institution. There are media and marketing teams already in those institutions, and then getting them on board early and not at the last minute where we're like, I want to get this out and blah, blah, blah. Getting them on board early, or getting the communities that you want to communicate with on board early so they can see what you're doing and you can have these conversations. And when you recognize that they are experts in their own regard, like we talk to other experts. Even a 4-year-old is an expert at being a 4-year-old. So so recognizing that they're experts in their own field and connecting that to what your message is and taking their advice. If they were like, hey, this is a good way to phrase this to the general public. I know researchers are like, oh, but it's in and not on, and they like teeter on these specific words sometimes, but it might still get the point across, and then that might help. So relying on the resources that are already at hand through your college, university, or your organization, and also having those communication, having that contact and developing those connections with the community in which you want to present to or you want to speak with is very helpful.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That was great. That is all we have time for with Tamara, but we will be coming back at the end for audience questions. Small correction in case you just tuned in, the Q&A will be available via Easy Retro, and you can add questions at the link that Brandy put in the chat. And please note, if you're unfamiliar with Easy Retro, we will provide instructions before the Q&A. Thank you again, Tamara. So I would like to introduce our next speaker for today's Fireside Chats, who is Brian Southwell. Welcome, Brian. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at RTI International.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here with this wonderful group. My name is Brian Southwell, and I'm part of the Fellows Program here at RTI International. And RTI is an independent nonprofit research institute, which is based here in Research Triangle Park, although we've got folks positioned all over the world. I also have the pleasure of being on faculty at a number of different universities, including UNC. And for this discussion, it's also relevant to mention that I'm part of an entity at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine called the Standing Committee on Advancing Science Communication, which has been a group that's taken a look at best practices and tried to see what we could do to move things forward in this domain. And in addition to that, I host a public radio show here in North Carolina called The Measure of Everyday Life. Over the course of my career, I've had a chance to look quite a bit at public understanding of science and health and different issues and ways that we may both track information as it flows through society and do what we can to try to improve people's engagement with it for their own well-being. So I really appreciate being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Brian, and we appreciate you being here. So let's dive right in. So what does the research tell us about how scientific teams can build trust in their research outcomes across political and cultural divides?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't think we've spent enough time, really thinking about the research literature, because there is one with regards to this question. I think part of what we need to talk about is what do we mean by trust? It's a concept that we all have a common sense, awareness of, and yet we don't actually spend a whole lot of time thinking about what we really mean by it. Too often, I think we focus solely on intellectual credibility. on the letters after a person's name, or their sense of prestige. And we also know, though, if you ask people to talk about what it is that they actually mean by this concept, trust comprises other dimensions as well. It involves consistency or reliability. If somebody's constantly saying something different, that can be sometimes hard to really depend on them. And yet that's at odds with the fact that science itself evolves sometimes. So there's a challenge for us. But also we know that trust involves a sense of shared interest and values. And so if there is somebody standing at the front of the auditorium who has a lot of academic credentials, lots of published papers, they're talking about something, but you don't actually think that they personally care whether you live or die. There's a different sense of relationship, there. That might be the case if you actually think you have shared interest and vested interest and shared values. So I think what we need to do in terms of talking about our work is to spend much more time highlighting the shared interests that do exist between institutions, between research groups, and different communities. And I think we need to make that more explicit. It's not going to be an impossible task. I think there are lots of ways in which we can do that, but we need to make that much more apparent than the academic credentials that we're bringing to bear and talking as an expert.
Thanks, Brian. I actually interviewed a psychologist recently who said that anecdotal sharing is much stronger than facts because people are just so quick to dismiss facts as information. And so if you share personal experiences with emotion, that's actually a key way to connect with people. It kind of reminds me of what you just shared. So talk a little bit more about how your findings inform best practices in combating information, especially when it's emotionally charged or value-based.
Yeah. Well, and I think you might, if you're worried specifically about dealing with inaccurate information or misinformation, which is one of the challenges that we face right now. I think we've actually gotten this problem somewhat wrong itself, because I think part of the challenge is that we're thinking about this in terms of needing to combat misinformation in order to we somehow are being infected by this foreign agent, which is causing all kinds of chaos. And it's certainly not great that the information environment sometimes includes inaccurate information, but I think we need to spend a lot more time working with communities. We've got to spend time both in this, in some ways, dovetails with what Tamara mentioned here. But think about what are the questions that people have? What's the information they're trying to get, and what can we do to actually provide trustworthy information to address those? Personally, I think that part of the challenge that we face right now is in a polarized society. We're not leaving a door open for people to come back, after disagreement. We've got to leave the door open for folks that at one point in time might have had a misperception to then, later agree with us. Otherwise, where are we? If we're really ruling out, the possibility of ever connecting with folks who have ever been wrong, we would have a big problem. In addition to that, we're not spending enough time giving people good reasons to constantly trust and come to the information sources affiliated with the institutions that we work at. So I think personally, something that I tend to keep in mind here is there are certain instances in which there's only so much you can do about the current environment. And if you're in a situation, as we sometimes face here in North Carolina, for example, where I'll draw on a weather example, if you'll pardon that, but imagine we have a severe storm or a hurricane that's off the coast. There's not a whole lot we can do about that in the 24 hours leading up to it in terms of actually getting rid of the hurricane. But what we can do is do what we can to try to connect with neighbors, keep people safe, try to mitigate the damage. And I think similarly, part of what we can do as science communicators is to help communities navigate through this really bewildering landscape sometimes. And I think if we did a better job of that, we would be in a better shape. So it really is more a matter of building community rather than just trying to somehow vanquish misinformation from all corners of the internet.
And I think community is a very central theme of today's chats in general. We're talking about team science, right? So we have communities within our teams at work. So I'm curious, what are some emerging areas or findings in science communication that collaborative research teams should be paying attention to?
Yeah. So something that we looked at recently for a report of the National Science Board, National Science Foundation. Every couple of years, they put out reports for Congress, and we look periodically at public understanding of science. And something that was really compelling in the 2024 report was that when it comes to confidence in science, generally speaking, one of the predictors is the extent to which people not necessarily understand, scientific facts per se, but the extent to which they actually understand the process of science, understand how science works. And it's something that I don't think we've done a very good job of, opening, pulling back the curtain and talking about. So I think if we did a better job of actually improving and giving people more information about the process of science, we'd be in a better spot to both talk about the iterative nature of it, the fact that headlines change sometimes, but also for people to realize how much it sometimes is their neighbors, that are involved in these scientific teams. And team science itself is something different than just one person, declaring what the truth is, or off on their own as an individual scientist. And that's something that's important in the 21st century for people to realize how much we do have this collaborative, effort, which is both good but also complicating sometimes in terms of the results we come up with.
And I think some of that curtain was actually pulled back during the pandemic. I mean, I talked to an expert in coronaviruses here at UNC who said it's kind of like the world got like a public health 101, and it was like, oh, well, here's why washing your hands is important, and here's, why distance can be beneficial for mitigating infection rates, right? So, I mean, I think in some ways we learned a little bit about this, but the pandemic also really like launched us sort of into having more of these conversations. I want to know like what research teams, how they can evaluate the effectiveness and impact of their communication strategies beyond reach.
It's a great question. And it's often we're ready to rush into evaluation without actually stepping back and asking, what is it that we're hoping our communication strategies are going to accomplish? And this is complicated sometimes for science communication work. There are instances where you might have a persuasive, campaign. You're trying to get people to change behavior. That's not always clear, in the case of sharing, research findings, exactly what it is you want people to do with the information. And so, are we trying to improve community decision making? Are we trying to invite more people in to participate in science? Are we trying to dispel, misperceptions about, particular concepts? Those are questions that we need to ask and answer before crafting evaluation plans. If we did that, we could evaluate these efforts better.
Can you give any examples of how to invite people in? That really like appeals to me. And like, again, community is just a steady theme throughout our conversation.
No, I think that it's really a matter of, understanding the work that we're doing and its relevance to so many facets of life, and that's something that I don't think we spend near enough time talking about how scientific results actually have an implication for our economic well-being and for ways that the different sectors in life intersect. That's something that we could do a much better job in terms of storytelling. Yeah.
Well, Brian, I think that's all we have for time right now, but thank you for sharing all this great information.
Great.
We're going to move on to our next guest, who is Michelle Jewell. Michelle, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in the science communication world.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. Again, just a huge pleasure to be on this panel with friends and colleagues in this space. My name is Michelle Jewell. I'm the Communications and Engagement Manager with the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. It's based at NC State University. We're funded by USGS through the Department of Interior. And we work on climate adaptation solutions for states, tribes, nonprofits, and other partners across the entire region, from Arkansas to the Virgin Islands. So that's one hat that I wear. I'm also the president of the Science Communicators of North Carolina. I'm privileged to have a few board members here today as well as part of that group. And we're looking to build community with science communicators across the state and invigorate a love of science across the region as well.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Well, let's dive right in. So how can institutions and research teams balance institutional messaging with the need for authentic, community-connected communications?
I was thinking about how to make my answer longer here, but my answer really is they shouldn't be different. That is kind of the problem. And if they are different, you're kind of facing an existential issue between your team and whether or not it's placed in the right spot. Um, of course, institutions have strategic plans, but hopefully those strategic plans are informed by the communities that they hope to serve. So if there's a big difference between that, I would throw a little bit of a red flag. I would caution people to think a little bit more carefully. Yeah, it shouldn't be a decision between one or the other, generally.
I think I think that this is a question people are asking, and so it is good to hear that answer.
Yeah, sometimes, Lisa, just to waffle a little bit more on that one, but and I understand where this question is coming from, especially in our environment today. We'll get to a question a little bit later about integrity. But yeah, it's sometimes you just have to stand by what you're doing, even if the winds are kind of blowing against you.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. So that's great to hear, and really encouraging. In today's polarized climate, I mean, we're already talking about it, where research institutions and scientists are increasingly facing scrutiny and defunding. How can science teams communicate with integrity? Here's the question, while also protecting their ability to do impactful independent work.
Yeah. Gosh, this is a question I think about every day at work at the moment. The last 4 months, it's not a secret, are very, very different than what we have had in the past few years. The advice I give, especially to research teams right now, is from first aid. I pull directly from first aid. One of the first things you learn if you train in first aid is before you rush in to help somebody, or before you rush into the fire, you have to stop and assess, is this safe for me? And I think we all need to take that beat in our communication strategies right now. Is it safe right now? Is the risk potentially worth running in and communicating about these issues, problems, or research that we're doing? I think if we look at the long arc of environmental justice across all countries, we know that at some points you can run that ball super fast, you can communicate, it's safe to talk openly and proudly about the work that's being done. And then there are other times when politics can swing or values can swing where issues need to be kind of quietly shelved isn't maybe the right word, but the work continues, but maybe there's less of an outward communication campaign about it, right, in order to preserve that work. And that's what we're thinking about a lot right now is how do we too continue our integrity with the work that we're doing while also ensuring that we can continue to do the work in the future and evaluating what are the safest ways to communicate about our work at the moment. And for us, it's been looking a lot like internal communications. It's been looking a lot like more email-centric communications. And it's been being a little bit less active on social media, to be completely honest. So I think we all have permission to reevaluate our environment and decide what are the safe avenues to talk about parts of our research and what are times where, or places where maybe right now it's not the safest option, and being okay with that.
My team was having this exact conversation earlier today, and my director made a really valuable point, which is, while we're not communicating on certain projects externally to large audiences, we're doing a lot more of that internal communication to support them, to try to reassure them to keep moving forward, and that their research is still valid and very valuable. And so we're still communicating, it's just changing, right? And we're doing it strategically. What advice do you give teams who want to translate their work for real world audiences but feel unprepared or unsupported?
Here too, I was thinking, how do I make this? The answer to this one is a little bit longer. So one, I would recommend if you're feeling unsupported, or what was the other unword? Sorry, Alyssa. Unsupported or
Underprepared.
underprepared, right. If you're feeling underprepared or undersupported, at first I want you to take an internal look and ask yourself, are you underprepared? Or are your perfectionist tendencies taking over a little bit, right? Are we thinking maybe that there's a benchmark that we should be able to hit that's actually unreachable? So number one, evaluate yourself for that. Number two, with unsupported, again, I would ask internally to seek and say, am I unsupported or have I not asked anybody for help yet about this issue? And I'd encourage you to think about asking for help and communicating what you need help with there too. If you're working at a university, if you're working within most institutions, there are communications teams. There are public information officers, talking to one right now. There are several folks at the university, crisis communications managers, that can help, but they won't help if they don't know that you need that help. So reach out. There are also really brilliant writers across the triangle. The Science Communicators of North Carolina is a part of that. And there are networks within those organizations too, where you can reach out and ask for help too. To touch on tomorrow's point too, this is a field of study. Science communication is a social science. It has been studied by brilliant minds like Brian. There are lots of best practices out there that you can learn from, and know that nobody was born science communication skills, right? They're all things that we learned over time, informed by those best practices. So there is a wealth of knowledge out there. There are people out there, even right now, and I would argue especially right now, who are out there waiting to help support researchers through this time.
And I'll just add, that's exactly what my team does in the Office of Research Communications at UNC. You know, we're not just doing storytelling, but we're doing internal support, helping with private grant funding and where can you find that, and lots of resources. So just
Yeah, communicators, we live for an email. Like, reach out. That's our whole thing.
no email's too small either. Just
Yeah, that's
ask the
right.
question. What does successful science communication look like when it's embedded in a research team's workflow and not just at the end of a project?
Yeah, the answer is kind of in the question here. And a concept that's been touched on a lot by Brian and Tamara is this idea of co-production. And co-production is, again, a whole theme. It's a whole category of science that you can look up. And there are lots of best practices of co-production. I'll throw a link in the chat later. I wrote an explainer about co-production that includes a podcast and like resources and lots of really fun things. But the idea is that communication is not viewed as an end product, but that communication is viewed as a shared responsibility across the research team, right? Everybody has a part to play in communicating. And you might rely on communication specialists, your PIOs, but everybody needs to work together towards achieving communication before, during, and then after the project itself. And co-production is this idea also that brings together a lot of diverse groups, so that there's a lot of diverse voices and lived experiences as well, which can only increase the effectiveness and the value of what you're communicating about your science. It's important that you're communicating, to Tamara's point, the why behind what you're doing, but that you're communicating that why before, during, and after the project too.
That's great, Michelle. Great advice. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's all you and I have time for, but we're about to open this up to audience questions. So just one more huge thank you to our guests today, Tamara Poles, Brian Southwell, and Michelle Jewell. And as a reminder, you can use the Easy Retro link that's been put in the chat here to ask your questions and to see what other questions have been asked. And now I'm going to hand it over to the team at RENCI.
All right. Thank you guys all for attending. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the Easy Retro board before we start with Q&A, and then we'll go ahead and dive in. So in order, what you see on the screen right now is our Easy Retro board. In order to add a question, you can click the plus sign at the top of any of the categories that you think your idea might fit into. When you're finished, there will be a blue box with a thin white check mark, and that will save it in that same field. Your idea will then appear on the screen for the public's reflection. You can also upvote someone else's idea by using the thumbs up icon. And you can also comment if you would like to using the quote bubble icon. So as a reminder, just before we get started, we will not have time to get to all the questions likely, but we will do our best to address questions as efficiently as possible. So please keep on adding and upvoting questions throughout the duration of the discussion. All right, so these questions will be open to anyone on the panel, including Alyssa. So I will just ask a question and please feel free to jump in as you are ready to do so. So our first question is going to come from engagement and outreach. How do you effectively pull in new audiences that are not already connected to your content or message?
If you guys are okay, I'll take that one. So that's what I talk about in some of my workshops is I talk about, okay, who are you talking to and who's missing at the table and why do you think they're missing at the table? And if a certain demographic is missing at the table, then find out where they are and then communicate with essentially a liaison. So maybe it's a grassroots organization within that community, or maybe there's just different community groups that you can reach out to and be like, hey, we have this information that we would love to communicate. It will help this community. What's the best way that we can communicate this? Or can you be my mouthpiece? Like sometimes you tag in somebody that represents that community, that is ingrained in that community, that can then speak to their own communities. So sometimes we aren't the ideal messenger. It's us trying to find who will be the best messengers. But yeah, the first thing I always have my scientists do is figure out who are you normally speaking with and why aren't other people involved? And what's your first step into identifying them? And usually it's doing some research, figuring out what's available, what resources are there, and who's doing what within the communities that you would like to reach out to, and then reaching out to them.
Wonderful, thank you. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this?
I'd just like to add this is a great space to use your collaborative teams, to use your relationships with other communicators or colleagues at your institutions. And, in my experience, people in the Triangle especially, I know this is nationwide, but people in general are very kind and happy to talk about what they do and connect you to their communities and foster those connections. And so I say just like reaching out and making more connections in order to hit those audiences that you are searching for.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, well, we will move on to our next question. From the practice category, how do we get researchers to spend more time engaging with community when the reward and recognition system insufficiently supports that?
This is a great challenging question that I'm not sure any one of us on the call or any one of us on the panel are going to fully be able to address, because there is a systems level challenge here, and there's been a longstanding issue in the way that tenure packages are evaluated. There are challenges with the way graduate programs are set up and what graduate students are incentivized to do or not. And I'm not sure that we can necessarily change that overnight, but we do need to be aware of it. And part of the reason to be aware of it is that you might be individually frustrated, in trying to get a particular person to work with you, and they don't get back to you. But it may not be necessarily your topic, or may not be the fact that they don't have interest, but they're running up against some of these challenges. So I think some patience is going to be important here. Sometimes we see this regularly. We'll come up with a clever idea for training with regards to science communication in a university setting, and then find out that, well, graduate students don't necessarily feel permission to engage in that from their advisor, or that they're spending time doing something else. And part of the problem has been the way that we've conceptualized what it means to then for a person to contribute. Because if your colleagues are thinking that, well, you're just building up your own portfolio of media appearances, or there's something that you're individually gaining glory here, that's not really the point. But that's often how we're kind of framing it, or people are thinking about it. But if we think about it instead, well, here's what we're trying to do to try to actually make sure that larger society understands the value of our institution so it doesn't get shut down, understands the value of why we do this work. We need to take a bit more of a community focus in terms of professional networks, and recognizing that there is a certain level. I think we probably need to be framing some of this in terms of service, and that may be something that might get more buy-in from folks. But the other angle to this is for people to realize that the immediate dopamine hit that might come from you being interviewed on a national TV show. That's not really, ultimately what's important is the idea that you might make a connection, or you might build discussion on a topic down the line, indirectly, that might help to further the topic that you're working on. And so we need to take a little bit more of a longer term perspective. But talking about all this transparently as people get trained early in their career as researchers, that's something that I think is really vital. And we need to spend much more time doing it than we've done to date.
Yeah, and Brian brings up an excellent point, and I want to dovetail off of that, is when you're communicating with different communities, one, you get that vision of what they care about, and that actually, for some of my researchers, have changed the question that they ask in their research to be more directly applicable to the general public. And also, to dovetail off of what Brian said, there's also funding sources. When you go out into communities and you start collaborating with them, there are other grants and funding sources that you can tap into too. So there's that dopamine hit of like being able to engage with the public and seeing your impact. And then there's that other long-term stuff of like funding and asking other questions for your research that directly impacts the community.
Awesome. Anybody else there? Perfect. I did notice that there were a lot of questions about learning more about the speakers. So the speaker bios and links are available via Zoom. We are also actively putting links in for you guys to view, and I will also let you know that we can certainly send out some links at the end of the webinar as well, just to make sure that you guys can look these people up. All right. So pulling the next question out of the engagement and outreach column, is there a dominant social platform that you have found to best facilitate collaboration?
I was gonna wait for Brian. Did you wanna, or Michelle? Did you want to?
Sure. I'll just offer, I don't think there's a one size fits all recipe with regards to this. I think it's crucial that you've got folks, this is a constantly shifting landscape. So the world as it exists is a little bit different than it was 5 years ago, but it also matters what it is you're trying to do. So I think, we've found actually some homegrown efforts to maintain learning networks. We've built platforms, for collaboration that are not necessarily social media, per se. There are other things that we've done, learning platforms and engagement platforms. There are other instances in which you're trying to find new people and you can create in groups on LinkedIn or whatever, work professionally, but then there are other instances where people, naturally, organically are finding and using other places, and it might make sense for your team to be there, but not necessarily. And that's, I worry about, kind of people having absolute recipes for this, because I think it really matters that you spend more time talking about what it is you're trying to do. But Tamara?
Yeah, I couldn't said it better myself. So yeah, exactly. It constantly changes. So you have to figure out who your audience is first. Who are you trying to connect with? Figure out where they are. And also that's a moving target sometimes. Like if we want to talk to more of like each other, I bet you most of the people in this group are going to be on Blue Sky or LinkedIn. So if we're talking to each other, those are the platforms that we go to. But if you want to talk to somebody else, figure out what age demographic, who you want to speak with. Maybe it's Instagram, maybe it's something that we don't even use yet. So that's where I would, if I was a scientist trying to figure it out, I would ask around, figure out where your audience is. And also you can ask other professionals like your social media and marketing managers, and checking in with that group, because they have to have their fingers on that pulse. So checking in with different folks that do this for a living and seeing where their audience is moving to or going, or where they spend a lot of time at doing that research up front, and then you got to try it. So sometimes it might work the first time, sometimes not, but that's the whole point of trial and error.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna add one thing. I'm gonna play a little bit of devil's advocate here, and I would almost argue that I think there's multiple platforms that serve different purposes, as Brian said. But I actually think like opportunities for face-to-face connection are super essential here. And, Michelle and I and Brian are all members and on the board of Science Communicators of North Carolina. What are your local groups that are relevant to the work you're doing, where you can physically go show up to meetups and networking events and you know, I think in the post-pandemic world, so many of us are thirsty for seeing people in real life again. And so, like, I would just like to advocate for, like, you know, real life connection as a social media platform. And maybe even just like returning back to that as a space to find ways to collaborate with others.
Yeah. I'd also kind of put a plug here, just based on some of the researchers that we work with at RENCI. We work with people who work in participatory science a lot. So that is specifically research that's being done with the public, and looking to platforms in use there can really help engage with the public as well, especially if you have something that might actually involve them in the research. So definitely something to look at as well. So. All right, so let's pull something out of the practice category. Are there gaps in science communication research that practitioners and institutions should be paying more attention to right now?
There's lots of ways we can think about this question, but I want to think a little bit about who we have even on this call right now, who we have on this panel. And there are really important professional networks that we're all involved with. But something that I see happen relatively regularly is that we don't have enough awareness of the networks in which we're ensconced, that we're living in. And we're blind to you know, the larger information environment that people are operating in, or shocked and astonished sometimes about, you know, what's out there. We just got to spend more time being systematic and thinking about, not from a surveillance or monitoring standpoint, but just trying to find ways to get into the different realities of different networks. And it's really partly a matter of like what information is flowing through and what people are engaged with. But I just think we make a lot of assumptions, you know, even in our generation of hypotheses or asking questions, really predicated on what is true from sitting in our offices, and that's something that we really have to move beyond. So that's a real gap that I see happen relatively constantly, and it's not to say that we shouldn't be building these robust networks of people that are interested in these topics. We absolutely should. But what could be also done to kind of figure out you know, what else is out there in the world and what other things are people talking about? And sometimes it's surprisingly actually relevant to what we do, but not using the same language. And maybe there's some opportunities there to connect.
And I think it's not a gap, but I will say that it is a lesser known field that people like to go into, which is mine, verbal science communication. When I talk to science communicators that are graduate students or postdocs, they always want to get into science writing. There's nothing wrong with science writing, but there's this whole field of verbal science communication that is necessary, because science writing, you're still leaving out some of the public, the busier parents or the busier adults that can't sit down and read that article. How are people getting their news most of the time? Podcasts, something audio, something, maybe it's TikTok, maybe it's YouTube. So getting into those fields more often. So that's a piece that I always try to advocate and letting people know there are different forms of science communication, and everybody's going to be good at one or multiple ones, but there are just different avenues. Could be just social media, could be face-to-face, could be discussions, it could be written. There's a huge field here.
Thank you. That's an excellent call out. So going back and just pulling the questions with the most upvotes here, we're going to the engagement and outreach column. What advice would you give basic science researchers for building community in online spaces?
I'll offer just a thought here, and this goes back to something that Michelle said you know, earlier. You know, I think we ought to walk away from a discussion like this not being afraid, and then actually seeing the strategic value in upholding integrity and consistency, and being a group that, and what I mean by that is, you know, if you bring together a group to focus on particular ideas or topics, you know, be consistent, and also not be afraid to, you know, to be wrong or to change your mind. I see this happen. Here's an example of this. You know, earlier we talked about, well, what could be done to improve or address, you know, misinformation with regards to science. something that we don't do enough in those discussions is to recognize that actually there are some instances in which we might have opinions about X or Y, but we don't actually have the empirical evidence. So something shouldn't be labeled misinformation just because we think it's a really dumb idea and it's really, you know, ridiculous. And it's not something that, but actually, technically speaking, when you're talking about misinformation, you ought to be talking about something that's counter to what the consensus is, or, you know, what the accumulated evidence is. And if there isn't such evidence, you have to admit that too, and be humble. And similarly, I just think these groups ought to have, you know, faith that if you're consistently able to talk about your work with truth and integrity, that over time you're going to build and maintain an audience. Don't take the shortcut in terms of being sensationalistic, and don't and actually be consistent with the rules that you've set for engagement. You know, and if it's a group online, if people are violating rules that you've kind of agreed to, even if they're your friends or even if they're saying the right things politically that you agree with, call them out on that, because that's going to be important over time. So just holding on to integrity, I think, is the only thing that's going to save us, frankly, over the long term. And so what can we do to, you know, and when that breaks down, as it will for all of us, admit you know, that we made mistakes and try to reconnect. Yeah.
And also recognizing that online communities is exactly what I just said. It's a community. So there you can like, follow, and share other people that are like-minded as well to amplify their voices. So any way that you can amplify somebody that shares the same values and things like that as you do, that's also a good way to do it as well. So look at the landscape, see who's doing it correctly. You can even DM them, and because like I've had people DM me and I just talk to them and give them advice, or they will talk to me and be like, hey, have you seen this? So sharing valuable information that way as well and connecting with folks.
All right. I think we have time for just one more question, maybe. What tips do you have for communicating the impact of our research in the current political environment, especially for grant funding that is at risk?
Oh, fine. I'll be the one who takes that one.
A tough question, right?
Well, first off, I just want to say I 100% relate to this question. I have lost about a quarter of our colleagues across the climate science centers are gone. We've had funding get put on pause. The president's current budget eliminates the entire ecosystems mission area, which would remove all climate science centers, all co-op units, and hundreds of other science centers across the country. So I can 100% relate to this question. My answer is a little bit unhelpful though, but there is a little bit of a hopeful note at the end of it. It's important, and we've talked about and touched on this, to constantly communicate the why behind the research that you're doing. And what I'm lucky with in the center I'm at, and the centers that are represented on this panel too, is that we have a long history of communicating the why behind our research. So now that we are facing what is legitimately a crisis of scientific integrity in the country, we don't need to convince anybody about the importance of our work. That job is kind of already done. What now we need are individuals, like the individual I also see in engagement and outreach, to take that motivation and to take that sense of justice and fight for these centers, right? And to amplify the why that we have been communicating for years about the work that's being done. So again, I would rely on asking for help. I would rely on your communication staff. They might say things to you like, right now isn't a great time to talk about what you're doing. It is a very good time to keep doing what you're doing. But wait for the winds of change to change, they will. And we can go back to celebrating the great and important work that we do more publicly than maybe it's safe to do right now. So yes, we have currently 70 graduate students funding at stake. Like, these are big, big times, and there is risk out there. But if you have been communicating your why regularly, and if you haven't, start today. Get those messages out there, but do be cautious. Be aware of the risks that are out there, and know, as to Brian's point earlier, those risks will change day to day, week to week. And what we always say in our world, we're adaptation professionals. We are used to dealing with uncertainty. We are some of the best professionals trained in uncertainty. And part of that uncertainty, professionalism, is just being constantly aware of what's going on a day-to-day basis. And the last thing I'll just throw in on that, with that awareness, and I hate to sound like a pillow cushion, but I'm gonna, self-care is super, super important, right? There is a fire hose of bad information right now, especially if you're working in the climate space. Stay informed, but not overwhelmed, and figure out where that line is for you on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. All right. I think that is all the time that we have for Q&A today. So before we leave, I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today. And I'd like to thank our audience as well. Really appreciate you guys joining us. I do want to remind you real quick that this is our last webinar for the year, as we will be taking the summer off. So for everybody in our audience and everybody on our panel, have a safe and fun few months, and we will look forward to seeing you all again soon. As always, we will send out the link to the webinar recording by email, so you'll be able to view that within the next couple days. Also, Jessica is going to share the link to join our mailing list in the Zoom chat now. So you can certainly join us to keep an eye out for when our webinars start up again, and get other information from our team here. Thank you very much.